appreciate you all being here for what it will be our last lecture of the fall semester, but we're putting together another group of Brookings scholars who will be coming out in the spring. So if you're on our listserv or check our website or Facebook page or follow me on Twitter, you'll get our schedule in the very near future. Hope we'll see you then. Tonight, though, a topic that's near and dear to all of our hearts, either individually or through our offspring or friends and family. Is college a good investment? And we're privileged to have Beth Akers here from Brookings and the Brown Center on Education Policy, where Beth and her colleagues are undertaking some very interesting studies. This is Beth's first trip out here to see us, but like our other Brookings colleagues, she's speaking to classes, she's engaging with faculty, and she's here tonight to give us a perspective on this, an economic perspective on this, which I think you'll find interesting. So I'll turn it over to Beth.
Okay, thanks so much, Bill. Well, for the record, as someone from upstate New York, I'll officially say that this is absolutely not a cold night, but I'll give it to you that maybe it feels like that to some of you here. You know, to build off of Bill's remarks that this is a topic that's near and dear to so many people, it's really what makes my job fun in researching in this area, because it is a topic that, you know, you go to a cocktail party and every person has something to say about it, whether it's student loan debt, oh, my niece is going to college this year, what should they do? And it makes it a lot of fun. So I actually hope that we can have a lot of interaction tonight, and you all should feel free to ask questions throughout the talk, because I get tired of hearing myself talk after a while, and it's fun to hear your ideas as well. So please raise your hand or shout out if I don't see you through the lights, but I'm happy to take questions throughout. So part of my job in Washington, D.C. at Brookings is to speak with the media about what's happening in my issues. So I'm covering higher education, and so what I've noticed over the past year since I've started there is that every call that I get from a reporter has somewhere in it this question: is college a good investment? Should everyone go to college? Or some sort of related question. So when they asked, what would you like to speak about at UNLV, I said, of course, I'm going to answer this question for once and for all, and I never have to answer it again, right? At least to you all, but you weren't the ones asking, perhaps. So I'll start out giving you a quote that the president said during his State of the Union remarks in 2009. So he says, by 2020, America will once again have the highest proportion of college graduates in the world. So I bring this out because I think that this sort of has an implicit answer to the question that we're asking tonight. So keep in mind this is in 2009. So the fact that we want more and more students without any qualifications getting degrees, I don't mean educational qualifications, but without any qualifications on this statement, just that more people need to be getting college degrees. End of the story. Okay, so then 4 years later, in the same president's State of the Union remarks, he says, my administration will release the new college scorecard that parents and students can use to compare schools based on simple criteria where you can get the most bang for your buck, for your educational buck. Okay, so there's been a subtle shift in the way that the president is talking about education. And it's no longer this unqualified, just go to college. It's this idea that we need to shop when we go to college, that we need to be careful about the return that we're getting on the dollars that we're spending on education. So given this, it's sort of natural that people are starting to ask this question: is education worth it? Is this a good investment? So I'm totally sympathetic, even though I joke about the media asking this question over and over, because it's become part of the national dialogue about higher education. So to start out, let me give you a little bit of a roadmap of where I'm going to go tonight. So first, the question again, is college a good investment? To clarify, what are we asking exactly? And as Bill revealed, I'm an economist, so I'm going to give you a theoretical framework that's based on my understanding of this issue and based on my training, and we can go from there. I imagine some of you will have some different ideas from what it is that I'm going to discuss, and I hope that in the discussion after we can talk more about different frameworks for thinking about this question. I think you'll see what I mean in a few slides. So we'll then talk about what it is we know, so where is the evidence here. a lot of the evidence is existing. It's been in place for several years. It wasn't things that I came up with originally. So I'll be citing a lot of other people's work. And then I'll go on to talk about some of the new empirical findings that I have in my research that I'm working on with some of my colleagues at Brookings and some people from the Federal Reserve Board. So then once we have figured out what's happening, what's going on here, let's talk about what we should do about it. So we'll conclude with some policy recommendations and, of course, some more discussion with you all and your questions at the end. So the theoretical framework that I'm going to use is, of course, that of the most basic economic framework. That's that education is creating both public and private returns. So the public returns are often referred to as neighborhood effects in economics literature. This is the idea that when people get higher levels of education, we have a greater society. There are higher levels of civic engagement. Neighborhoods are better to live in. People are better citizens. They're healthier. They rely less on social insurance programs. And so there are all these benefits that accrue to the society as a whole, not necessarily to the individual who invests in the education. So this is one aspect of the returns to education. The other is the private returns, and this is really where the discussion has been focused recently. And this is what you probably all thought of immediately, which are the returns in terms of heightened wages. There's also the non-pecuniary returns that are accruing to the individual, but these are things like health, right? So health is considered both a public and a private return, but you imagine that somebody who receives a higher level education achieves a better level of health. There's correlation and causation there as well. It's certainly a valuable return, but it's separate from the financial return that we talk about in terms of the wages, the heightened wages as a result of the college degree. So I'm going to focus on the private financial returns to college. And this is where I expect to get some pushback, because I know that an important part of this discussion are those other pieces, the public return, but also the non-pecuniary returns to education that are a little bit harder to measure. So why are we focusing here? Well, one, the easy answer, or the real answer, is because I'm an economist, and so I think of these sort of numbers right off the bat. But that's sort of a cheap answer. The real reason is, number one, it's the easiest thing to measure, right? We have data on wages. We know how much degrees cost. This is something we can do pretty easily and we can do pretty well. The second is that it's actually incredibly important for public policy. So again, I will not argue that those other pieces that are non-wage returns are not important, but I will say that the financial returns are incredibly important when we're thinking about public policy, especially if we're thinking of education as a vehicle for creating income mobility, creating access to upper and middle classes for individuals who start out in lower wealth households. It's incredibly important that we have the answer to this question about financial returns to education, particularly for that group. So the basic theory in economics relating to investment education is this human capital theory. And this is this idea that individuals will invest in education as long as it's individually beneficial to them. Okay, so maybe the strict interpretation of this theory is that it has to do only with earnings. Again, there are other returns that are non-financial, which you can imagine this model being able to accommodate as well. So the visual interpretation of this model is this simple picture here. And so these lines are two different trajectories that you could imagine for an individual. And there are an infinite number of trajectories that someone could consider. What these two suppose is the first is that an individual begins earning right after high school. Okay, so they enter the labor market right here at age 18. Their earnings follow the high school line. And they increase slowly over the course of their career. The alternative that's illustrated here is that rather than entering the labor market at age 18, the individual enrolls in college. This is illustrated through negative earnings. So you see that the earnings line is actually this horizontal line here, which is below zero on the vertical axis for earnings. So they're actually earning, in a sense, a negative wage for the first few years after they're potentially able to be in the workforce. Then what happens, the wage jumps as soon as they enter the labor market, and it's above where it would have been if they were had entered the labor force right after high school, right? So this is a really overly simplistic way of saying that people make choices between these different trajectories, or we believe that people should be making choices between this infinite number of trajectories, and they have some sort of information, even though not perfect, about what those different income profiles are going to be, okay? So you could take a look and imagine that college line had been much closer to the high school line, right? It may be the case it's simply not worth it to have forgone the earnings in these first few years right after college. And this really gets at the question that we're asking today, right? So how much higher does the college earnings trajectory need to be than the high school earnings trajectory in order to get people to make that investment, right? Is it worth it? We're giving up earnings during this period, but we're also giving up tuition dollars and fees for enrollment. So I'm sure that everyone in this room is painfully aware of the fact that college costs are rising, and they're rising pretty rapidly. So just to give you some context for discussion here, I have the statistic that among full-time undergraduates at public and private nonprofit four-year institutions, so bachelor's degree granting institutions, that the median published tuition fees was about $11,000 per year. Okay, so it's a pretty hefty amount of money, and I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you didn't already know with that. Something that's important to think about as we start to get into these more nuanced discussions about returns is that these numbers are not what most students are paying. Okay, so anytime we're trying to calculate the returns in education, it's very critical that we recognize that there's the listed price and there's something that we call the net price. And that's the price that students pay after all of the grants that they've received in terms of institutional aid, in terms of federal aid, including the Pell Grant. And these are pretty sizable. So we've had trends of increasing tuition, published tuition fees. There's also pretty rapid increases in net tuition, but it is important to recognize that it's lower than what the figures that are published. Next, we all know probably as well that the tuition inflation is outpacing inflation in other segments of the market. Okay, so obviously a troubling trend and relates to the question here, because as tuition continues to rise, we start eating into those returns of the heightened earnings that individuals receive after they graduate, right? So if we go back to that picture before, this negative space here, right, which is the cost that we're incurring, is going to be dropping lower and lower and lower as we have higher tuitions. So beyond the direct cost of being enrolled in college, we also, as we've already talked about, have the opportunity cost. So some recent work is estimating that for individuals foregoing income who would not have had a college degree, it would, in a sense, cost them $54,000 in terms of lost wages. So to illustrate some of these trends in tuition, I've broken out here by sector. So we have public four-year, and actually the legend is a little bit flipped from the way they are on the graph, but public four-year institutions are this middle line, private four-year institutions are the top line, and the public two-year, these are community colleges, on the bottom. So we see that there's been over this period, which is 4 decades, pretty rapid growth, especially among private four-year institutions. But even if you look at community colleges, these are after inflation prices, so that the increase here is the increase above inflation. We have pretty decent growth in both of those prices as well for four-year as well as public two-year institutions. So the first component of this calculation, again, whether or not this is a good investment, is the cost, right? The second is, what are the benefits? The benefits, as we said, in this framework that we're using tonight, are the labor market returns. So the first evidence of this comes from just taking a look at what are the outcomes that college graduates are facing in the labor market. So this is pretty well documented that there's a dramatic wage differential between these two different groups of students. If you look at individuals with bachelor's degrees in the labor market versus individuals with just a high school diploma, we see a difference of about $15,000 in 2011, and this is on an annual basis. So you can imagine over the course of a lifetime, of course, this is going to add up and become a pretty large figure. So individuals with college degrees are also unemployed at lower rates, which essentially amounts to greater annual earnings over the course of their career. In September 2013, which is the last available data at the national level, we see that the unemployment for people with bachelor's degrees is actually half of what it is for individuals with a high school diploma. So I mean, these are pretty dramatic differences and really factor into this equation of whether or not there's a financial return. It's not just the wage differential, it's whether or not you're employed and earning that wage, and for what fraction of your career are you out of the labor market because you're unable to find employment. So this illustrates that point a little bit further with more detail on different levels of education attainment. So before we were talking about this differential here between bachelor's degrees and those with a high school diploma. But you can see that there's obviously a dramatic differential between, less than a high school diploma, master's degree or higher degree holders are earning much more. So what we've talked about are the differences between earnings for people without degrees and people who have degrees. Okay? This is absolutely not the same as determining what is the causal effect of education on your employment outcomes. Okay? So, some students I was working with this afternoon made the very astute observation that is this a correlation or is this causation? Okay? So people with master's degrees are earning higher incomes than people with just high school diplomas. Is it the case that these people just have higher aptitudes, they're better people, they interact and they communicate more clearly, and they just have these skills that both allow them to achieve a master's degree but also allow them to succeed in the labor force? Or is it the fact that the master's degree is actually causing them to be more productive and allowing them to earn those greater wages? Right? So it's a little bit of both. And so when we do calculations of financial returns to higher education, this is the primary challenge. Okay? So it's actually a very difficult thing to separate. So the studies that are doing this are using sort of sophisticated methods to tease out the effects. One of the better studies indicates that the return to 1 year of college is 10% on earnings. So if you do some calculations, you'll see that this is actually far less than the strict wage differential between people with a bachelor's degree and a high school diploma, right? So 4 years accumulating at this level will not get you to the wage differential. And what that reflects is that the wage differential that we observe is, again, caused by the fact that they're different groups of students with different abilities and the fact that they have earned the degree that raises their level of earning power, their level of productivity in the market. Okay, so it's sort of these two things combined, and that's a really important thing to keep in mind in this discussion. So using some different techniques, again, there's a variety of ways that you can estimate this. None of them are bulletproof, but since they mostly say the same thing, we can kind of imagine that we're pretty close with these answers. The estimates for a bachelor's degree are that you can earn just over $500,000 more over your lifetime than a high school graduate, and an associate's degree will earn you an extra $170,000 over the course of your lifetime. So again, we're comparing this additional earnings over the course of your lifetime to the upfront cost of $40,000, whatever it is for the degree that you're earning. So this is the cost-benefit calculation that students and parents need to be doing when considering whether or not a degree is worth it, whether it pays off. So here we are, the culmination of the talk. So is college a good investment? And so you all can squarely answer this question now. So is it yes? It's yes, right? So yes, and please don't read the fine print here because it's yes for most students. Okay, so I'm tired of this question from the media because it really misses the big point, right? We know that on average the degrees are paying off. They're paying off by a lot, okay, but that's sort of an uninteresting point. right now. We know that it's a good investment. People wouldn't be going if it wasn't a good investment. People are smart, people are rational, and people are clever. What's interesting is for who is this not a good investment, okay? So there are tremendous variations in the outcomes that students face after graduation. This is driven by differences in students, it's driven by differences in institutions, and also by field of study. So even though I've told you all of this rosy data about how well these degrees are treating students and how they're having these great financial returns in the long run, there's a recent study using data from PayScale, which is sort of questionable because it's self-reported data, but regardless, it makes a really interesting point. That using the data that they have, they identify that there may be as many as 200 bachelor's degree programs that create a negative return on investment for their students. Okay, so that means that there are clearly lots of institutions that are creating higher returns than the ones I cited on the previous slides. Otherwise, we wouldn't get to the averages that I reported, right? But yeah, question?
So what is your take on the PayScale data? Because in the Chronicle, there's been a very intense sort of conversation about the validity of that data. So if you have somebody like Brookings quoting something like this, and the media is going to pick it up, but you may be quoting data that is totally suspect. Yeah,
so I'll say with the caveat, this is PayScale data, which I don't trust, but it's the information that we do have. So I think that it should inform the discussion. For those of you who don't know, PayScale is a website where people self-report their earnings and they self-report which institution they attended. And so you can imagine that the people who go onto this website and report their earnings, report where they got their degree, are just totally different from a representative sample of the population of graduates. And so this is really the concern.
So I guess my question to you is more, does Brookings then repeat this to, because at what level does it inform the conversation? It may misinform if it's given to the media, whereas in an academic discussion it may be informative because we realize that there's caveats with the data, or it may be bad data. So you could actually be creating more misinformation by giving it to the media.
So what I'll say is that I would not write a paper using the PayScale data and then hide that in a policy report, which I then sent out to the media. What I would do is in a place like this where we're having a discussion is identify this as a point of interest. So I'm not going to hang my hat on this number. What I'm going to say is that it creates discussion around this idea that there may be institutions and students who are getting a negative return on investment. I would never say that it's 200. I have no idea what it is. Maybe it's just a few. But it's almost unreasonable to think that there are no institutions that are providing a negative return, right? So, you know, it's sort of provocative in that it gives this idea that we should be thinking about that. But again, of course, I would never, they actually do name some of the institutions, but I would, of course, never do that because I don't think it's necessarily a valid way of doing it. But yeah, thanks so much for that question. Okay, so yeah, stepping back, again, we have huge variation in outcomes, and this is exactly what we should be talking about, rather than the bigger question of whether or not a college degree is worth it. So just to break it down by institution type, this is not even by institution, we can see that there are some pretty dramatic differences in the returns that are estimated. So again, this is PayScale data, so we're going to take this with a grain of salt. But what it shows is something that we probably should be thinking about anyway, whether or not we trust this data. And that's that we see among most competitive institutions, the rate of return may be as high as 13%, and non-competitive institutions may be only 6%. Okay, so again, all of these are positive, but they're all averages within this set of students, within the set of institutions that are within the categories. Okay, but there's huge variation here, and that's the important thing. So again, there's variation by major. So this is based on a different study, but we see what we already probably all knew, which is that engineering, computers, and mathematics, they come out way ahead in terms of earnings, not just in the initial years following graduation, but also if you sum it up over the course of their lifetime. Okay, so when you ask the question, is it worth it? Is college worth it? How about, is a college degree in mathematics worth it? Or is a college degree in the arts worth it? Right? So we need to become a little bit more sophisticated in the questions that we're asking. So again, even this idea that returns are positive, right? You all are here because you thought this was an interesting question, and you know, you didn't know the answer already. And part of the reason is because this idea that returns, even on average, are positive is conflicting with the narrative that's happening in the media right now about higher education. And you know, if you're plugged in at all to the discussion on student loans, you will have seen this number over and over and over again, and that's that outstanding student loan debt has passed the $1 trillion mark. So again, I'm sick and tired of seeing this number, just like this question. But you know, the assumption here is that this is a terrible thing, right? Oh no, $1 trillion. And it's always the headline in these articles about students who are facing these just terrible outcomes, or former students who are facing these terrible outcomes. And what's missing from this headline is then outstanding debt passes $1 trillion. $1 trillion was spent on investments that created X trillion dollars in GDP. Right? So we're sort of omitting the second piece of data here that's absolutely critical in understanding, you know, the context for this. Okay, so the narrative is really popular. New York Times did a piece where they were highlighting this anecdotal evidence of students who were, of course, living in the basement of their parents' house after graduation. And you've probably read these stories. They happen every time there's a recession. The students always are living off cans of soup and have these really expensive degrees, and they have, you know, they're really portrayed as just having incredible hardship. And it really makes you think, oh gosh, like, is college worth it, right? It's so natural that we're asking these questions because the media has done a really great job of pulling out this set of individuals who are not getting the returns that we're talking about. In reality, the problem may be that the people we're highlighting, we're capturing them at times when they're unemployed, they haven't yet found a job, but in the long run, they're fine, okay? There was a study recently, and I wish I could quote who it was by, but I won't because I'll probably misquote it. But they went back to this media coverage in the previous recession, and they followed up and they found all of these students who were living in the basements, eating soup to survive, and they showed what had happened with their careers, and they were all extremely successful. They were doing incredibly interesting things. And the point was that it's not that there are not students who are having negative returns on their investment in post-secondary education. It's that this is an incorrect portrayal of what's happening. It's not these students who are going to these expensive liberal arts colleges, getting academic master's degrees, then moving back home, and that's the sob story, right? That's not the sob story. There is a set of individuals who are not winning in this game right now, but we need to work a little bit harder to figure out who they are, okay? It's not necessarily the people who are captured in these stories, not the basement dwellers, as I call them. And I always ask, why can't they live upstairs in their parents' house? They have to live in the basement, but no one knows the answer to that question. So how does this reconcile with the other evidence we have? First, to just bust this myth quickly about the basement dwellers, as I'll call them, this is data that's looking at the rate of moving back home after college for 3 different years. This is a survey that is administered by the Department of Education, and it's broken down by the amount of debt that individuals take on, because this debt story is a really critical part of this narrative in the media right now. And what we see is that these individuals that were interviewed in 2001 graduated college in 2000, immediately before the market collapsed again, or we entered a downturn in the economy. So these people were hired during an expansion period in the economy, and as you can see, this is the middle bar in each of these segments. They're not returning home after college at very high rates, right? So you see, like, regardless of debt, they're going home at about 18%, right? So 18% of these graduates in 2000 move home with their parents and I guess have to live in the basement. And then in 2009, which is really what's informing our discussion now because it's most recent data, just over 25% of students are going home after college. So it's a pretty big number, and it's understandable that this has become part of our discourse on this issue. But what's important is, one, that is consistent across all levels of debt, okay? So it's not debt that's driving students to live at home. And if you have probably already noticed, the level of returning home after college was very similar back in 1994 when we weren't in an expansion period in the economy. Okay, so what's happening is that during recessions, people move home after college to live with their parents. Okay, this is not a reflection of the fact that college is not worth it, or that student loan debt is drowning our economy, or all these other dramatic things that people like to say. So what is the truth about student loan debt? This is an important piece of evidence here. You know, you can look at all these estimates on the returns of education and still not walk away very comfortable, right? Because you say, well, I know all these students who have this debt and they're unemployed, and there are always these actual outcomes we can observe. So let's take a look at those instead of the projections using the other data. So even though these students in these popular media stories have over $100,000 in debt, the average borrower finishes a bachelor's degree with about $25,000 in debt. And to put that in perspective, remember that the estimates are that over their lifetime, they'll earn an additional $500,000 as a result of that degree. Okay, so a large number if you think of it in terms of your current earnings, but not a huge number if you think of this as something that you're going to pay off over the course of your lifetime, and you're going to pay it off with that heightened level of earnings that you achieved through that degree. It's a little bit higher at private institutions. Because the tuitions are higher, it's a little bit less at public institutions, of course. So this is an interesting number, but now we're getting into some of the findings from my own research, and that's that I'm now looking at not just students at this point in time when they finish their degree, but I care about the financial position of individuals in the years after they've finished their degree. So really this whole lifetime span. And so I'm using some data from the Federal Reserve Board that surveys a representative sample of US households, and then I'm looking at within that, in younger households, which are the ones we're most concerned about, what does their education debt portfolio look like? Okay, so it's great. We know you graduate, you have $25,000 in debt, and as I said, unemployment rates are really high among people just after college. A lot of them are moving home, waiting to find that perfect job. So it's, you know, sort of not informative to base our understanding of their financial well-being in this really short period right after graduation. So really we want to look out a little bit further. And when we do that, I'm looking at, in this case, 20 to 40-year-olds who have education debt. The average debt that they have outstanding for this population is $6,500. So really not a tremendous amount at all. Some of this is because people are paying off debt. Some of it's because you know, people take on debt and pay it off through gifts from family. You see that pretty often in the survey data. Some of this is through household formation. So if you have debt and your spouse does not, the debt then becomes shared and becomes less of a burden because you have dual income. For this population, the average monthly loan payment is $144. This doesn't reflect the fact that people are paying down their debt, and so you would imagine it's low because people are almost at the end of their repayment period. This is constant over time, so it really reflects that these loan burdens are, you know, not unreasonable, at least for the typical borrower. And for some more perspective on how much of a hardship that does create, the average earnings for this population, and this is with all types of education, not just bachelor's degrees or master's degrees, is $44,000. So the average borrower paying $144 a month with an annual earnings of $44,000. So it's not nothing. I mean, I'm completely sympathetic to the fact that this is, creates hardship for individuals to have to repay these amounts. The point is, it's not the dire situation that is often portrayed in the media.
But Beth, what about the distributions? I mean, what about the 90th percentile or something? Mm-hmm. Are there some people up there who are really, really hurting?
Yeah. So I'm going to get into that in some of the next slides. So keep that in mind and please ask me again. So part of the reason that we're so scared of this debt that we have and are maybe blowing it out of proportion is because we've had a pretty dramatic increase in the debt that people are taking on and in the fraction of people who have debt. So my data begins in 1989 and ends in 2010, and you can see over that period, initially 14% of the population were taking on student loan debt, and by 2010, 36% of the population had student loan debt. So it's really becoming an issue that more people care about because more people have debt. Also, the level of debt, this is adjusted for inflation, has grown just dramatically. So in '89, the average debt burden was $806, and that increased to $6,500 in 2010. Right, so some of my work is actually getting into understanding the changes in the amount of debt that people are borrowing over time. You can imagine there are a number of reasons, but one of them is the fact that tuition has increased. Tuition inflation has outpaced inflation for other goods. And the second most important thing is that the people who are going to college, or the population of people who are going to college, has changed really dramatically over this period. And that's in terms of socioeconomic diversity, racial diversity, gender diversity, and all these dimensions have different implications for borrowing behavior. So I think I'm one slide away from the distribution, so I'll get there next. This shows the growth that we just talked about visually. So not too much to add here, except as one of the students interpreted for me this afternoon, we see that, where do we have it? If you take a look at mean debt, which is the top light line here, we see it growing pretty rapidly over this period. I've also included median on this graph to highlight a point. So you see that median is certainly growing at a slower rate than mean debt. And what the student pointed out to me is that this reflects the fact that there are outliers in this population. So the growth is not necessarily in the middle of the distribution. It's not the typical borrower who's taking on more debt. It's rather that we have people at the extremes who are taking on large sums of debt, and that's what's driving the mean to go up so quickly. Okay? So here's the distribution. So what you can see is I've plotted the 1989. For data reasons, I've used both the data from 1989 and 1992, and this is the outstanding educational debt. And 89, 92 is the blue line. You can see that most of the density here is in these really small numbers, which makes complete sense because tuitions were incredibly low during this period. You'd have no reason for borrowing $100,000 in debt. And then when we move to 2010, which is the red line, you see that all of these really small borrowing amounts shift out to the distribution. So we have a rightward shift, basically a thickening of the tails of this distribution. But again, coming back to this portrayal in the media, in the media stories, everyone's out there at $100,000 in debt. And it's very obvious from this picture, which is really an innovation to have this picture. The previous data didn't allow this. We can see that there's almost no one out there. And it's important that I say almost no one, because there are people there, right? So in percentage terms, this is small. This is a very, very real big problem for those people who are there. So we'll talk more about that.
So it's noticeable it hasn't changed.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the size of that tail.
Right.
Yeah.
Not a big difference. The real action is around here in what some might perceive to be sort of affordable increases, especially once you take into account that a lot of it's driven by increases in educational attainment.
Is that inflation adjusted?
Yes. Yeah, so it's inflation adjusted with CPI, not with tuition inflation. Right.
Does this include for-profit institutions as well?
We take a look at the entire population of people in each of these periods, and we say whatever debt you have from whatever degrees you've earned from whatever institutions you've attended. So it's a very comprehensive measure. Okay, so just to kind of sum what we've talked about so far is, again, this conclusion that college does pay off for most students. We're not just on the verge of a crisis in student lending. And to expand on that a little bit, I think that this is a question I get often too. Are we about to have a student loan crisis? And I say, well, what do you mean by that? There are two types of crisis you can imagine. One is we have another mortgage crisis. The answer to that is absolutely not, because the scale of this market is minuscule compared to the mortgage market. Okay, so that's an easy answer. The second is, are we about to have a huge number of students, or even a decent number of students, who are in personal financial crisis? And so this is where, potentially yes, right? So we have a small segment of the market who are potentially in crisis. So now the idea is we stop asking this question and start asking, who are these students? So where is the crisis? Whether or not we want to call it a crisis or not depends on how big this population really is. So the next steps, and it's convenient, I'm setting up these as the next steps for all of us to be thinking about, happen to be the next steps that I'm pursuing in my own research, and that's that we need to figure out which are the groups of students who are facing the bad outcomes. If it's by racial group, geographic, whatever it is, we don't know who they are. We know that there's someone in there who is. It's probably those people who are way out in that tail of that distribution, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's people with small amounts of debt but just very small earnings. We just don't know where the individual crises are. And then second, which institutions or set of institutions are creating these bad outcomes? And maybe none of them are, right? Maybe it's just an individual problem. We still don't know this. So these are the sort of patterns that we need to start looking for. Some of the work in this area has been focused on for-profit institutions, I think is a bit presumptuous at this point. There's no fundamental reason why for-profit institutions can offer a valuable service. It's just sort of a convenient thing politically for us to be thinking about to begin with. But this is really where the research needs to take place. In terms of the next steps in policy, there are a few things that need to be happening and need to be on the mind of our policymakers. The first is institutional accountability. And so fortunately, this is something that is big on the higher education agenda in Washington. The White House has proposed a new, very strict, very aggressive system of institutional accountability. In short, what they are planning to do is create a rating system for institutions and then tie individual students' financial aid to the institution's rating. So students who get an A get full eligibility for financial aid. Institutions that get a B, their students will get a little bit less eligibility for financial aid. That means smaller Pell Grants, less access to federal student loans. And obviously institutions at the bottom of that spectrum will essentially be kicked out of the federal aid program. Once that happens, students essentially stop going. There's no way for institutions without access to remain competitive in the post-secondary education market. So it's going to be something that's important to follow. It's critical because, as I was saying before, there are pockets of individuals who are facing hardship, who are in crisis, and the point is we need to figure out who they are. So this accountability system is really sort of trying to get down into that. The second step is creating a more sophisticated consumer in education. This is another initiative, so through creating financial literacy among consumers of education, and also a big push in creating greater availability of information so that when people themselves ask this question, is a particular degree that I'm considering a worthwhile investment, they have the data that they need to answer that question. So we don't want them necessarily having to go to pay scale for the reasons we've discussed to say, what are my earnings likely to be if I go to this institution? So the government is working on ways to provide earnings information to students before they enroll in college. That is earnings information of previous graduates, so that they have a way of shopping in a sophisticated manner. And then the last thing I'll end on, because I think it's so critically important, is that there will be students who make poor decisions in this market or who end up at institutions that do not create a positive outcome for them. And because that's the case, it's critical that we have safety nets available for these individuals. I'm always for less government intervention when it's appropriate, but I will say that this is a market that's just desperate for some type of paternalism. And the reason is that I'll use the example that I use over and over with with different goods. But so you can imagine I go out to the market and I want to buy a bottle of water. And I buy this one, which is by Niagara. And I realize, ugh, this water tastes terrible, which I shouldn't say because it was gifted to me by the folks at Brookings Mountain West. But imagine I bought it and I said, this is terrible. Okay, so I toss it in the trash. And so, okay, I'm out $1.50, right? So now suppose I go and earn a college degree. I spend all the money that it takes to earn the college degree. I'm now in the labor market and I can't get a job. I realize, whoops, that was a terrible choice. Unlike the water, this has huge consequences. It's not a decision that I make over and over again, and I can't learn from it. So there's really a role in this market for the government to step in and make sure, in the very least, that individuals have the information that they need to make good decisions, and also to sort of coach them into making the decisions that they should be making for themselves. So, yeah.
What if the metrics that they're using are flawed?
Yeah, you got it.
I'll speak outside of economics. I shudder at this new proposal on part of the president. It is fraught with all sorts of problems. Mm-hmm. And I actually was quite amused to see the Secretary of Education kind of shrug off concerns that teachers had, or basically all sorts of people had. So how can we provide accurate information to potential students when the metrics being used are eminently flawed?
I think that you're absolutely right that they are bound to be flawed. I'm optimistic about this. So I think that there unfortunately is not sufficient data to actually create a rating system that captures all the things that we want it to capture, right? Beyond that, it's not clear that all of the institutions in our post-secondary education system should be striving towards the same metric, right? So there are all of these issues. It's not clear that it can be done properly. There's a huge concern that the way that it will be implemented will cause institutions to not want to enroll marginal students, right? So this is something that I've been writing about recently. So you can imagine a system that basically rewards graduation rates, right? So if I'm an institution, I'm determining how am I going to respond to this new system that the government puts in place. If my graduation rate is higher, I get more money from the federal government. Okay, so when I'm thinking about my next class of students to admit, do I admit those students who I think have a low likelihood of success? Absolutely not, right? I mean, you have to make these sort of decisions to be able to stay in the market. So I think it's a real concern. The solution that I have to this, and I haven't convinced the White House that this is their solution yet, is that you can imagine a scale like A, B, C, D, and F, right? Just for simplicity. The metrics that they have the ability to create using the federal data systems might be pretty good at distinguishing between the A, B. We'll put A, B, and C in a group together, and then the D and F schools, right? So my policy recommendation, I think it's important that they do this because I think it's important that they figure out who those D and F schools are. So I'm going to write a blog post soon where I recommend that they not tie financial aid eligibility in any way to the differences between A, B, and C schools, but rather they start to phase out eligibility for aid once a school gets to D, and then they phase it out even further when they get to F, and then beyond that, they're obviously out of the game. So I think that there are serious concerns about how you can do this appropriately. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it.
I applaud the intent of it, but I'm very worried about the metrics that
Agree.
are being used to generate the data that's going to be presented.
I'm glad you raised the point about graduation rates here at UNLV. And there's sort of a trade-off for our students because most of them are working. I don't know whether your studies take that into account when you look at return on investment because they're not suffering the opportunity cost of foregone income. But in any case, on the other hand, they're taking longer than 4 years and often longer than 6 years to graduate. That makes UNLV look kind of awful when that metric is cited. Though I suspect on net our students are rather successful given the fact that they are earning while learning.
Yeah. So
is there any way of addressing that?
So there are a couple nuances there. So one, they are facing the opportunity cost because the wages they're earning is not a college graduate's wage, right? So you imagine that they're,
It's not high school graduates.
but it's not a high school, right? So it's something in the middle. So they'd probably be better off financially in the long run if they were enrolled full time, but that's not the point. I'm not trying to.
If they're Valley Parkers, they're earning more than we are. But anyway.
Okay, yeah, I'll give you that. So I think the point is we don't necessarily want these people to graduate in 4 years or to be enrolled full time in order to improve that metric. But another thing that's happening here is that the published graduation rates are based on full-time entering freshman students. And so these are the people who enroll for 4 years, stay on campus, maybe then they take 5, 6, 7 years, but it's all full-time enrollment. So the population that these numbers are based on is sort of irrelevant for institutions like yours where you have a lot of non-traditional students enrolled. So this, I mean, really exacerbates the point we were just talking about, that the data that we have and that we're currently using to evaluate institutions is not the best. And it's really not capturing, you know, some of the success that these students are experiencing, like you suggested. Yeah.
It seems like there's the added complication that's unavoidable of not just the problems in the data, but that it also becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, that once these predictions come out, even as it exists now in the system, those things change the nature of the system itself. And so if you give a school an A, more students will try to get into that school, it will become more selective, those students will do better. It will change the fundamental dynamics that are trying to be evaluated.
Yeah, so I think what you're getting at is it will drive changes in the student populations, right?
Right, on both ends. You give a
Yeah.
school a D, and basically that school's finished in
Right.
terms of its ability to produce good earning graduates, and it's not only the value added by the school, but it's the impression that someone gets of the quality of a graduate of that school.
Yeah.
And both of those things will be affected.
Right. So something that's critical when they do this is that they properly take into account student populations. So what I was saying before, which is that certain institutions are going to look bad on particular metrics because of the populations that they serve. So the metrics, if they're done properly, really need to take this into account. One way you can do it is using a regression adjustment, which is not a politically popular idea because it sounds sort of nerdy, but it's this idea that you create some predicted value based on the population of students that an institution is serving. And you see how they do relative to that metric. And so if they're doing better than that, you give them a good score. If they're doing worse than that, they get a bad score. So it's basically everyone then is competing against themselves, and it's no longer like you suggested that all the institutions or all the students are shifting to the A institutions and out of the D institutions. But yeah, it's an excellent point. Yeah.
Does the institutional accountability necessarily have to be to where the lower schools get a decrease in funding rather than the better graded schools, in a sense, get an increase in funding to make them seem more competitive rather than punishing the lower ones, in a sense?
Well, I think what you're talking about is really the framing of this, because you could have the exact same financial structure and call it what you're calling it as opposed to what I'm calling it, right? So the eligibility for financial aid could be structured, the same as what I've described, except instead of saying that it's the poor performing institutions that are being penalized, you say it's the high performing institutions that are getting a benefit.
Yes, but will that make a difference in the long run? Will it make the higher institutions better in the same exact way, or will it be different because of the way that it is rewarded in a sense?
I don't imagine that it would create too much of a different incentive. My guess is that these institutions are pretty calculating in their decisions, so whether you call it a penalty or a reward may make a difference for an individual, because individuals are not completely rational and we're sensitive to framing of things. I think it's usually the case that institutions that are either profit-seeking or not profit-seeking, but act as businesses are going to be sort of onto that. So it's an interesting idea. Maybe it would help the politics of the discussion. Yeah, thank you.
As far as safety nets, how do you feel about putting loan protections back in place as far as bankruptcy, particularly for people taking out private loan debt that have fallen into a trap of a nonprofit institution where they're not going to get their returns?
Right. So, we have pretty sufficient safety nets in the federal loan marketplace. For those that you don't know, if you take on private education loans and you go through bankruptcy, they stay with you. So it's sort of, it's a completely bankruptcy remote lending, which makes the lending institutions just more profitable, right? And there are serious concerns about that. It's not clear to me that there's any reason for that. I can understand theoretically why it was in place. Education debt is different from other types of debt because there's no collateral. So, you know, it's easy to get a home mortgage because if you stop paying, the bank can come take over your house, right? So with labor, there's no way to make personal contracts so that I can guarantee you that you have some claim on my future earnings. And so when they created this bankruptcy protection for student loans, this was the idea. It sort of, in a way, made it a collateralized debt because, you know, you have access to their earnings for the entire course of their lifetime. But I think that, well, I don't know what the answer is, but I think that we need to think more about regulation in the private market, and that's probably one of the first things to think about. Yes?
I was interested in some of your comments about for-profit institutions and how it's politically popular and all.
Mm-hmm.
In my class, we looked at several reports from the College Board.
Yeah.
And it's maybe not causal, but it's pretty clear that one could conclude that for-profits are about 9 or 10% of the enrollment, but 90% of the problem. I mean, so there's, I mean, there.
What do you mean by the problem?
Of student debt. So, I mean, if you juxtaposition, you know, student debt with tuitions and for-profits as providers, and there's a place for for-profit institutions, to be sure. But all I'm saying is that the readings that we've done in my class seem to suggest that it's not just a political issue. There seem to be evidence that may not be exactly causal, but is pointing in the direction of saying a small number of institutions are a disproportionate part of the problem. You can easily make that conclusion.
I think you can easily conclude that there's a correlation. And I think I would never argue that they're not the problem because I don't think that we have the data yet to conclude that they are. But what I'm worried about is these private institutions are often emerging and saying, we provide services for these students who happen to be the ones who take out a lot of debt. They're former military, maybe they're single parents, so they have babysitting on campus. They integrate well with the different you know, social programs to help veterans. So they in theory are able to provide, they're trying to get into the market and compete on this dimension that they provide this additional service. So if that's the case, then we want that, right? I mean, that's a good thing. And the fact that their graduates have more debt than others is an understandable thing. So I'm concerned that if we just wipe out this market based on a you know, pre-existing bias against for-profit in this industry, that we may lose something that's valuable. So I think it's important to just be careful that we don't reject them off the bat. And so, you know, I'm not going to argue that they're doing a good thing yet. We don't know that that's the case. So. Yeah, but it is important to note that there's correlation. So, yes.
Are you only looking at undergraduates right now, or are you also looking at graduate students taking out debt? Because I know a big issue is, you know, particularly in higher ed, because so many people that get PhDs and sometimes MAs, you know, are planning to go back into teaching at the college level, and you know, we have a huge amount of part-time faculty now, which is flipped from what it used to be so many years ago, or people aren't able to make the kind of earnings that they would coming out with a graduate degree. So is that taken into account in any of your research?
Yeah, so the data that I'm looking at, that's one of the advantages, is that we have all of your degrees. So the debt from your entire educational career. So in the next steps, we are going to be looking at the financial health of people who have graduate degrees and different types of graduate degrees. So not distinguishing between professional, like law, medicine, and business from more academic master's degrees and PhDs. So that's definitely going to be an interesting part of the story because actually that's where a huge amount of the growth is in borrowing. So it'll be really interesting to see, you know, some of the research is showing that those are the groups who are disproportionately able to take advantage of the loan forgiveness programs, which is sort of intriguing. Is it because they're in hardship, or is it because of some glitch in the system? So that's absolutely one of the first things on our agenda.
Since no one asked my question, can I use
guess
my
so.
prerogative? You started off with a couple quotes from State of the Union addresses of '09, I think, and then '13. So my question is, would you care to predict what the 2017 State of the Union might say about this?
No, absolutely not. I'm not. I don't want to be cited up for that.
We'll let you go on that one. Questions anymore? Last one? Beth will be around if you have an unasked question that you'd like to. Thanks very much for joining us and for the great questions. And I hope we see you in the spring with a whole new lecture series.